Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Art in Focus of Fall 2024. For those of you who may be tuning in to one of these for the first time, my name is Dr. Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum. And our Art in Focus series is one that takes place each month when we select one work of art on view either in our permanent collection or in a temporary exhibition. And first, we have a in-person version of Art in Focus, which now takes place at 12 noon. So if you're local to Fairfield, Connecticut and want to stop by, you can join us at the next one. And then at 1 p.m., we do it online and virtual. And in both of those situations, we love for it to be a conversation. So please feel free to pop in your thoughts, your questions, your observations as we go through. And Jessie, our producer, will be sending them through to me as we go forward. I do want to, and she's going to drop into the chat, a link to the exhibition in which this particular print and the subject of today's Art in Focus is on view right now at Fairfield University. The show is called Ink and Time, European Prints from the Wetmore Collection. It's on view in our Bellarmine Hall galleries through December 21st of this year. And it is a show of all of woodcuts, prints, well, prints, of course, are an umbrella term. Woodcuts, etchings, and engravings ranging from the 15th through the 18th centuries, all of them borrowed from the Wetmore Collection at Connecticut College. So we are very grateful to our friends at Connecticut College for lending us this fabulous collection, one of which is the Albrecht Dürer Adam and Eve. So I realized that this picture was very blurry. It is not a professional photograph, but one that I think I screen capped this out of a video. Jessie, the video that is on the website that Jessie has dropped the link to in the chat for this exhibition. The print, though, to give you just a sense of scale, the Adam and Eve is at the center of that back wall, and it's actually flanked on either side by other very iconic images by Albrecht Dürer. If you're familiar with his work, you might recognize the titles of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is to the left of Adam and Eve, and the St. Jerome in his study engraving that is directly to its right. But that's just giving you a little bit of a sense of what is really the remarkably small scale, this beautiful engraving from 1504. So when we were down in the galleries together, one of the first things that I mentioned, and I've said this to all students, especially who come through the galleries, imagine any piece of paper in your home, your office. Imagine any one of those pieces of paper lasting for 5 centuries. Because this one has lasted already for more than 5 centuries, and we certainly hope that it will last longer. The date of 1504 is actually in the little engraved signature that is off to the upper left. But prints of any kind are always a miracle of survival, although paper, in its early form especially, is a very interesting nexus between delicacy on one hand and durability on the other. So we're delighted that this particular impression of Dürer's iconic Adam and Eve did survive, did make its way into the hands of a collector named Fanny Wetmore, who gave her whole collection to Connecticut College back in 1930. So one of the things that struck me as that we have been using this print already, and the show has been on view since September 12th. We haven't had our official opening night yet. That is still to come next week. But already we have been welcoming university classes, public groups like Art in Focus. And last Friday, I had the pleasure of working with not one, not two, not even three, 4 separate college courses that were focused on the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible, which is the official title of the class, taking whichever perspective on the text you might be taking, whether Christian or Jewish. And one of the things that was a fun challenge for me was to actually go back to the text on which this engraving is based. It's the book of Genesis, chapter 3. It is much too long to include here in any of the slideshows, but if you are interested, I would definitely encourage you to go to an online website like Bible Gateway that allows you to choose from any number of translations, and just remind yourself of the richness of the story that we are looking at. And I know for many of you, it is a familiar story. And it's been fun with any group that comes in. I will ask, can someone sort of recap us the story of Adam and Eve, or this particular episode, which is often subtitled The Fall of Man? And, you know, people usually have it in broad strokes, like there's something about a tree, there's a fruit, there's something someone's not supposed to be doing that they do anyway, and they get caught, there's a punishment. But what's marvelous is that you go and look at Genesis 3, and there is so much more there than you might recall. And we were talking about this in the in-person group. I did actually very professorially printed out some copies of Genesis 3 and handed them around so folks could take a look as we were discussing. But you are welcome to scan over the internet while we're talking and chime in with what strikes you as you look at the source text. One of the things that really stuck out to me in rereading the story in conjunction with what Dürer makes of it is the level of specificity, which we know, if you know anything about printmaking, about Dürer, you know that granular attention to extraordinary detail. Let me zoom in a little. Look at the delicacy of those hatch marks, the marks of his engraver's burin in a plate. They are of extraordinary detail, but the detail even starts in the time of day that we're seeing. Because I think in my mind and in the past, and this is the print that is very familiar to me, I think I always thought that Dürer decided on the setting to be a little bit dark in the background because it provides a very nice visual offset to the naked bodies of Adam and Eve. They come across as mostly white on the sheet, and behind them is the garden, but instead of a sun-filled garden with the tree, the forbidden tree at the center, we have this very dark, moody environment. And we can see some of the animals that are tucked in there. There's the elk walking through at the bottom. There's the ox off to the lower right. We have a rabbit. We have a cat. But there is this sort of enveloping darkness around them. So like I said, I had always kind of thought of that as, an artistic choice meant to offset the main characters. And then when I went back and I read the text, when the critical event, Eve is convinced to take the fruit by the serpent. She's given it to Adam. They've realized suddenly with their new knowledge that they are naked. They cover themselves with fig leaves. It's the next section where God comes back. And there's a line, of course, I didn't bring my printout with me to read you from the one that I printed, but it's a line that God comes back in the evening at the hour when the quiet breeze is blowing through the garden. And I just thought that was one thing, wonderfully poetic and evocative. The fact that the text literally says it happens in the evening, this encounter between God and the sort of newly awakened awareness of Adam and Eve. And then I looked at the setting that Dürer created, this dark wood, and it makes perfect sense. So in one sense, you have an artist who is treating a story that we all feel we know really well, but he has really dived into the details. So speaking of details, I wanted to just give you sort of a close-up of some of the elements of the print that is downstairs in our gallery. And many of you who are fond of prints are very familiar with this terminology, but not everyone might be. So I will just say, when we talk about the print Adam and Eve, the engraving of Adam and Eve, we could be talking about any of the many hundreds of surviving impressions of Adam and Eve. We have one on view at Fairfield. There are many others in museums around the world. And Jesse is also going to drop into the chat a link to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to their finest impression of the same print. And I'm sharing that because if you would like, as we're going through, if you'd like to be able to blow it up on your own screen to highlight certain details, this is the wonderful thing about technology and the internet. I can share with you a link to a website where that is possible. Just as long as we bear in mind that the physical object that the Met has and the physical object that we have on view are not the same thing. Or as I say to my students, they have each had a life. Some may have been treated better than others in their past lives. And part of what art historians love to do is think about the different journeys that an individual art object might have taken to come to us. So we have the top of the print, which lets us see very beautifully the faces of Adam and of Eve. We see this signature at the upper left, sticking out from a tree with a parrot gripping onto the end of it. And one of the participants downstairs in our in-person version, she had focused in, and I say focused in, she took a magnifying glass. She had focused in on the loop that is connecting this signature tablet, which we can envision like a piece of slate. And she said, well, it just looks like it's awfully permanent. That it's not tied there, but someone has fashioned maybe a loop of metal and slid his signature tablet onto this little branch, which is linked to the main trunk of what it looks like, quite close to what Adam is holding onto. And I'll touch on the signature a little later, but one of the things we talked about was like, yes, even at first glance, the maker of this object really wants you to know who did it. He wants your name to be very present. So the fact that Adam has his arm up and around that will helpfully lead your eye up to his signature, as if you could not notice it. We have the center of the print, which in many ways can be said to be where the action is taking place. Because what do we see at the top but a very intense looking serpent? In the same way that the fruit that's just described as a fruit of some, the only fruit that gets mentioned actually is figs. But in the context of what do Adam and Eve do when they've eaten of the forbidden fruit, they realize they're naked, they take fig leaves and they fashion clothes for themselves. And we see those leaves concealing the genitals of Adam and Eve as we look further down. And taking our gaze all the way to the bottom of the print where you see some of those animals that are tucked in. We have the rabbit with its back to us, though its ears very up, very alert. And we have a literal game of cat and mouse at the lower left, although that cat has always struck me as being a little sleepy, even though its tail looks like it might be just getting ready to flick. Well, I know I put this detail in there somewhere, but I had actually forgotten exactly where it might be. This signature that Dürer gives, there are lots of ways in this particular print that Dürer would like us to be impressed by him. And I'm saying this with great love and affection because Dürer is an extraordinary artist. He has incredible skill at making woodcuts, incredible skill, control over the engraver's burin and making prints like this one. He is a painter, and he is very much an entrepreneur of the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century. He has realized, in fact, that prints, which are sort of this revolutionary technology in the late 15th century, that allow an artist's idea to no longer be a single object, a single painting, a single sculpture. All of a sudden, they can be replicated. Your visual conception can be put into the hands of many different individuals. So really, it's fair to say that democratizing art for really the first time in Europe, making prints in this way. It does not hurt that you can make money this way in a sideline business to individual one-off commissions as he was receiving all the while. So Dürer wants you to know that he made this. He wants you to know that he is very talented at what he does. So he has on this little signature panel, not only his name, but also you can just make out his own monogram. Very familiar to folks who've seen other Albrecht Dürer works of art, the A with the nested D inside it. So a trademark he's adding to his works of art. But Dürer also really wants us to know that he is an educated man, that he has traveled, that he is familiar, for example, with the educated language of Latin, in which he has rendered his hometown, Nuremberg, as Noricus. So Albert, Dürer, Noricus, all in Latin, and then a really fun word to say below, which says faciebat, and then 1504. One of the students who came to the gallery on Friday, I was just jokingly asking, like, does anyone know Latin? And someone had said, yeah, I took Latin in high school. And I said, great, well, tell us what faciebat means. And crumpled like a wet paper napkin. But faciebat is an imperfect tense. What this really says is Albert Dürer of Nuremberg was making this in the year 1504. And okay, so it's a way of him using a little bit more Latin. One of the things that Dürer is trying to show off, and I'll go back to our main print, he had gone to Italy. And he would go again in a couple of years, but he had gone in the last years of the 1490s. He was very proud of the fact that he had come into contact with the Italian Renaissance and some individual artists, like, for example, Giovanni Bellini, who he was very keen to meet in Venice. And one of the things that he is doing in this print is melding his own particular fascinations with something like, for example, human body proportions or the search for ideal human proportion, something that also had consumed Italian Renaissance artists. If you think of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, where he's trying to work out something the first century CE author Vitruvius had said about ideal human proportion. Dürer would like to encapsulate that and let the world know that he is able to play on that same playing field. And he can do this in multiple ways. One is visual. The figure of Adam, the pose in which he stands with one hand sort of outward and curled and the weight on his forward leg, that is quoting a very famous statue that is in the Belvedere at the Vatican in Rome, which he hadn't seen in person, but probably had seen drawings of. So he's quoting something that other well-educated, well-traveled people would already have a sense of, something Italian Renaissance artists were also copying. And he's also, by using that imperfect faciebat, was making this. Well, the young would say he's jumping on a trend. This sounds cheesy even as it's coming out of my mouth. There were Italian Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, who were looking back to ancient Roman authors like Pliny, who, also writing in the 1st century, gives us lots of the information that we've got about ancient Roman and Greek artists like Zeuxis and Apelles. And Pliny had happened to mention that, these ancient, well-revered artists, they would demonstrate their humility by not saying, I made this, perfect form being fecit. They would say, faciebat, I was making this. It's not perfect, it will never be done, but simply here's my offering. So 1,500 years later, this is getting floated, so the cream that's floating to the top in the Italian Renaissance, just one little thing that is plucked out, that someone like Michelangelo imitates when he does his Vatican Pietà, for example. He signed it across the chest of the Virgin Mary on a strap, and he signed it faciebat. And here is Dürer jumping in on the same trend. He's signing his engraving of Adam and Eve, showing these perfect body proportions, using the same phrasing that, again, is this implied humility. This is never done, never complete, but I was making this. That has a lot to do in a piece of paper that is less than 8.5 by 11. And of course, that saying scratch the surface when you're talking about an engraving does feel a little on the nose, but really you only scratch the surface in a short conversation about Adam and Eve, because there's so much you could unpack about this engraving. And it just so happened that one of the folks in attendance in our in-person meeting was a professor who teaches, among other things, medieval literature. And I had just commented that the theory of the 4 humors, which is an iconographic layer of meaning behind the animals, I have never been drawn to that. So I'm not going to highlight it, but merely suggest that there are lots of layers of meaning that an artist like Dürer is capable of mixing together. There's information coming out of or ideas coming out of a contemporary conception of the 4 humors that governed the human body, and how they might have been at one point before the fall in perfect balance, as they never were again. He is folding in the ideas about human body proportion, something that he was really fascinated by, and he wrote more than one treatise about it. He's folding in his trip to Italy. He's bringing in a little bit of that classical content. And one of the things I love is that even though he is going to give you his ideal Adam and Eve based on ancient prototypes, he's going to keep them looking really German looking. There's just something very Northern European about the features, the way the hair is represented. I'm also just going to shout out Eve for having what looks like a 4-pack, which very impressive. He's not going to slavishly copy any other type or depiction of Adam and Eve, but he's going to bring it into his own sort of orbit. Well, before I show this, I'm going to go back to this. One of the things that I find, for me personally, helps appreciate the levels of artistry that have gone into the creation of a print like this is really thinking about the materials of its making. So I will see how well this translates to showing on a screen as opposed to down the gallery where you're able to sort of pass these things around. But imagine this is a little sheet of copper. See that lovely shininess, although it is slightly discolored. Imagine a sheet of copper that is 7 inches high by 5 inches wide. That's what Dürer is working with. He has an idea. He is going to engrave this into the copper. And to do it, he's using, I'm going to go back to one of these detail images there. All of these wonderfully, densely interlaced lines, every one of them has been carved with one of these. This is called a burin, B-U-R-I-N. Those of you who are familiar with printmaking know very well what it is I am holding. It has this interesting sort of mushroom-shaped top. It has a long, straight shaft, and then I'm not sure if it will show up, but it has a diamond-shaped end. And what Dürer has to do is, even if he may have the most wonderful conception in his mind, he must translate that to a metal plate. And the procedure for doing it is not very natural to us. You hold the burin sort of in the meat of your palm. You let your index finger sort of sit on it to guide. and you take your metal plate, and you have to come in at rather a shallow angle. You're not mining for gold. You are looking to just excavate little furrows of metal from your plate. And when I was in a workshop where we tried some of this ourselves for folks who are not printmakers by trade, but wanted to get a sense of the hand skills necessary, one of the things that struck me was that you generally will manipulate the plate more than your hand. You will keep this angle and sort of move the plate to shape curves, for example. And how easy it can be for an unskilled person like myself to accidentally dig in too deeply. As you change the amount of pressure, you may create a deeper, wider furrow. But if you want a very, very delicate line, you're just going to need to take a little off the top, as the barber would say. So it requires an extraordinary amount of skill and control. It is really just extraordinary to imagine. But it's also something that must have happened in iterations. We rarely have a lot of evidence for it. So this incredible object, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows, I believe this might be the only known example of what is called a proof state of Adam and Eve. And what we are looking at in this physical object that lives at the Albertina in Vienna, we are looking at a version of that copper plate or another metal that he might have used, where he has not finished it, but he has inked it and run it through the press to see how it's coming out. And what's incredible is you look at the right-hand side, he has only put in the barest contour outlines of Eve's legs. He knows exactly where they're going, but he's done no shading, no gradations of color. Adam is halfway done. He's done up to the fig leaf. So when I say that this is perhaps the only state, rarely do these proof states survive for Dürer. Obviously, when you get to someone like Rembrandt, we know he went through lots of states, but it is a fascinating opportunity to get a sense as if we're lifting back the curtain and seeing the execution process. To come back to our main view here, I was explaining to the folks gathered downstairs that Dürer is here. He's got his burin. He is engraving his lines into the plate, and there is a little bit of invisible labor going on, because I do somehow doubt that Dürer was inking and printing all of his own plates. And as I have observed, and those of you who have done any kind of printmaking will know, some of the most challenging work actually comes in the part after you've inked it. You only want ink to remain in those little furrows that you've dug out of the metal. So you have to wipe it all off. Or rather, you take something that looks very much like cheesecloth, and you might spend 10 minutes of sustained, gentle rubbing with successively finer cloths until you achieve a final appearance that almost looks like there's nothing left on the plate at all. Because when that plate is run through an intaglio press with an enormous amount of pressure, you want there to only be particles of ink in those lines to be sucked into or pressed into the dampened sheet of paper that you've run through. Any even microscopically small bits of ink that you leave on the areas you didn't carve, they'll show up too. And they'll show up as something we often call plate tone. So the amount, and I've watched master printers do this, the amount of sustained patience that you've got to have to keep wiping, even when it looks clean. Even when it looks clean, they'll scuff their head, the edge of their hand across the plate, come up with a little more ink, keep going, keep wiping. It's really just extraordinary. So not only the physical engagement with the plate in terms of carving out these furrows takes an extraordinary amount of effort, but also the print run would have been incredible. Now, I mentioned at the outset that you have someone like Dürer. He's trying to layer in all of these different layers. He's got the classical world and its illusions. He's got medieval thought on the four humors that govern the human body. He has his own desire for increased fame and awareness. And then at the root of it all, we have Genesis 3, the text, the fall of man, as it has formerly been called. And one of the questions I've asked anyone who looks at this with me is to really think about what moment of the story, that whole long story, which when I printed it out kind of takes a sheet both sides, which part of the story did Dürer decide to encapsulate? And often what it has come back to is looking at the center of the image, as folks have discussed, like, well, what is the interaction between the snake, the fruit, and Eve? someone who was with us just now said, well, the early discussion between the serpent and Eve is the serpent is trying to say, well, don't worry, you won't die if you eat the tree. You'll just gain knowledge. Eve says, no, I can't, we'll die. So one of our visitors, Pat, said, well, maybe what's happening is that the snake is proving that it's not poisonous. Like, this is something I had not thought of before. So the snake poison testing. But it has also commonly been pointed out that while the snake delivering the fruit to Eve would put us at the beginning of the story, Adam, I don't know, it's a little bit hard to say what his engagement is. We'll look at he's looking toward Eve, certainly. His hand is open, this gesture with the fingers curled slightly. But he is hard to read. And someone in the group we were with just now pointed out that his mouth is a little bit ajar, and his gesture could be regarded as sort of a reference to ancient depictions of oratorical gesture, someone who is speaking. And the same person had just commented that, well, if that were the case, then Dürer would be inventing some extra lines for Adam because he doesn't really actually have a speaking role until God comes back and confronts them. And then he blames the woman that you, God, left here with me. But it's the presence of the fig leaves that does also suggest that they've already eaten it. So we have the serpent seems to be delivering a fruit to Eve, but they're both wearing the fig leaves that in the text they only put on once they gain knowledge and are aware and ashamed that they are naked. And just to sort of throw an extra layer of potential ambiguity in, if you look at the right margin, Eve has another fruit in her hand too. So could we in fact be in the middle stage? Maybe Eve has already taken a nibble out of the one that she's kind of holding behind her back, which does seem to be connected to her leaves though, so maybe it's not the same fruit. Maybe the one in the middle is the first one, or is it the second? But yet they already seem to have knowledge. And of course, you can read this as Dürer is a very capable artist. He knows how to mix and match like little Easter eggs, bits of his narrative, because at the end of the day, one of his goals is for us to keep looking. So yeah, he will give you those deep layers of the woods. He will include the tiny figure of the goat, the scapegoat of the Old Testament, perched on the hill at the upper right. Anything to keep you engaged. This is meant to be an object for religious contemplation, religious thought, for people who are very familiar with the story and the text, who might well be literate and be reading it either in Latin or as new bits and translations were coming out in their local German. He's giving you a lot to look at because it's something that will keep you returning to this image, maybe discussing it, making it a point of meditation. But you could say that that is one of the signs of a strong artist, that he can weave all these layers together, that he can keep us and leave just enough ambiguity that you're trying to figure out how does it map onto the story as we might have heard it. I should say, by the way, that a very well-known print scholar who wrote a book on prints and people, his name is Hyatt Mayer, he had actually called this print a bit of a failure. He said he felt that Dürer got bogged down in the details, but he had a phrase that I just really loved. And he said that he spent too much time on a cat and mouse game in the waning instant of the world's innocence, which is just a wonderfully poetic phrase on its own. So I'm sharing that with you. And if you have questions or observations about anything that is on screen, feel free to pop them into the chat and Jesse will send them over to me. But I wanted to take our attention back down to the lower right-hand corner and to, well, part of the cat and mouse game. I mentioned that I asked Jesse to put a link to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's own impression, or one of their impressions of Adam and Eve, so that if you wished, you could zoom around and really appreciate, for example, if we're just looking at the base of the tree that you can see above the cat, look at those sort of concentric swirls that are giving you the sense of that bark. And really, if you've ever laid hands on a burin, and as again, I am only a neophyte with this, one of the coolest things to feel, I learned that copper has a grain to it, much like wood. So you can be sort of at the right angle, but you're just feeling the sense of resistance. And when you're going with the grain, it will slide like butter. It's the coolest feeling. And I certainly don't have the artistic skill to back it up by using it to craft this level of texture. but Dürer does, and he's giving it to us. But the impression that you will see at the Met, much like the impression you would see at many other major museums, they are extremely fine impressions, as print scholars would refer to them, meaning everything about them, they are in top shape, great condition, no issues, 10 out of 10, no complaints. The prints that are in our show, as I said, they've had a different life. They were in Fanny Wetmore's collection at some point in the early 20th century. They are in a study collection at Connecticut College. And they are not all the finest impressions because they come from a world of print dealers through various routes. I'm just pausing here because I saw a comment from Marianne that there's a beautiful collection of Albrecht Dürer in the Malta Museum. I have never been to Malta. Strongly desire to go, especially because of Caravaggio's presence there. So I'm directing our attention to this little corner because you may be able to make out in the cat's tail, for example, looks like brown. Those are places where this print has previously been damaged and at some point had been restored. And they were doing it effectively with like a sepia ink in such a way that they're not trying to conceal that it's a restoration. They're not pretending that it is original, but they're also trying to sort of fill in the gaps so you wouldn't be distracted by there being a loss in the area of the cat's tail. Lots of the prints that you'll see on view in our show have those small areas where they have had past touch-ups. They've had a little medical care, for example. But what is interesting about the reverse of this print, which you can't see, I didn't photograph it on this one, but I photographed it on the adjacent prints. Go forward one. The print that I show, when I showed the view of the exhibition, and I said there was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Adam and Eve, and St. Jerome in his study, all works by Dürer on the same wall. The image on the right is on the reverse of that Dürer, the reverse of the Jerome. The same marks with different numbers are on the back of this Adam and Eve. And one thing that those marks help shed light on for us is a little bit of sense of provenance. We would love to know where this sheet of paper has been between 1504, when it was sold at a print dealer's shop in Nuremberg in Germany. Where has it been between then and let's say 1900? I don't know what year Fanny Wetmore acquired it, but let's say around the year 1900. That is 400 years of movement that is unaccounted for and probably will not be able to be filled in, except that we have these stamps on the back of both the Jerome and the Adam and Eve. The blue one says Wales MFA collection with a number underneath. The Wales collection is a print collection at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So we are seeing there a stamp that was added with a unique number when that print entered the MFA's collection. And then on the bottom, it doesn't come up here, but it's purple. I love the ink color. Purple, it says MFA canceled, and then there's an area for someone to have initialed. And what that is saying is that at some point, both of these prints were de-accessioned from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. They were released into the wild, as it were. And if you visit the MFA in Boston, their collections website, you can look and see they also have several very fine impressions of Dürer's Adam and Eve. So at some point in the past, they did not need to keep an additional one, and they chose to release the one that had some damage to it. Out it goes into the world. It wound up in a print dealer in New York. His name is F. Mader, and into the hands of Fanny Wetmore. That's as far back as we can track it. Unfortunately, we don't know how it entered the Wales collection, for example. But it's interesting to get any number or any indication of those breadcrumbs. And the last thing that I will share, actually, let me just check. Oh, sorry. Anna says, can you talk a little bit more about the top right corner? This corner lacks the high level of detail and texture that Dürer uses in the main portion of the composition. The cliff and goat look almost cartoonish when compared to the realistic details of the rest of the piece. I absolutely agree with you, Diana. And I'm going to go back, see if I can go back to, I find it interesting in the proof state, it doesn't really look to me like the goat is really even part of this. I mean, I'm not able to zoom in on this particular image, but I don't really see, go forward a couple, oh, wrong way. I see the crag, and I see that sort of V shape. And on the right, we should be seeing the tiny shape of the goat, and maybe it's there. Oops, I'm going all the wrong ways, I apologize. Now, that could mean anything, that could mean nothing. It could be that Dürer is looking to build in a little bit further distance, because if not for that corner, which does have some areas at the upper right where you see it with no ink whatsoever. That would be the only corner of that copper plate that was left untouched. No lines incised into it whatsoever. If he didn't include that, if the darkness continued up into that corner, perhaps he felt that would be a less effective creation of a sense of pictorial space. So maybe that's there to show us that on the other side of the garden, there is, as we can see, light, because certainly there's light hitting that goat, there's light hitting that promontory. So it could be there to create that sense of depth. But I agree that the goat has always struck me as kind of a strange detail, the way it is outlined seemingly in nothing. There's no cloud, for example, taking up that little corner. So that is a great observation, and also reminds us that a print like this repays so much time looking at the individual small details. I realize I didn't put a picture of it in here, but that's fine. The last thing I just want to mention is something that is in our show and ties back into this question of where do these things come from. I mentioned that we really don't know, or maybe I didn't mention, we really do not know much about Fanny Wetmore. There are some scattered receipts when she purchased from print dealers, like this one, but very little is known of her. Life and death dates don't seem to be known. So it was a great pleasure for us this summer at the Fairfield University Art Museum when a local library, if you're not from around here, the Westport Public Library, they had emailed me saying that someone had donated a book to their annual sale, and it had a book plate that belonged to Fanny S. Wetmore. And they asked if we would like it. And of course we said yes. And it turned out to be an 1849 dictionary of painters and engravers. And as we flipped through it, and when I say dictionary of painters and engravers, it was famous European artists, a brief biography, and then lists of the titles of their works, no illustrations or anything like that. But for Dürer, for example, there would be a list of all of his paintings, all of his known woodcuts, all of his engravings. And someone had gone through and put little pencil tick marks next to a lot of the entries. Now, of course, we can't prove that Fanny Wetmore left them, but it is interesting to know she owned this book. It could well have served her as she was building her own collection, which was particularly strong in works by Albrecht Dürer and also Rembrandt. So we have that book is on display as part of the exhibition. We have an image of the book plate blown up that's on the pedestal on which the case is standing. So we hope that if you are local to Fairfield University and can drop by, the show is on view through December 21st. We will have other Art in Focus events coming up. I think the next one that we'll do in October, we will turn to the Italian Renaissance, and we will be looking at a collaboration between Marcantonio Raimondi and Raphael on the Massacre of the Innocents. Unless there are any final observations or questions, I would just like to thank you for joining me for the virtual edition of Art in Focus. And we hope we will be welcoming you to our galleries in person very soon. Take care, everyone.